The Florida Everglades once covered 11,000 square miles of the southern peninsula. Not a swamp, a river, inches deep and 50 miles wide, creeping south at roughly 100 feet per day across a limestone shelf so flat that a change in elevation of a few centimeters could redirect water for decades. It started in the Kissimmee River Basin, filled Lake Okeechobee until the lake overtopped its southern rim, and then spread across a vast mosaic of sawgrass marshes, wet prairies, and tree islands before reaching the estuaries of Florida Bay. The whole system ran on almost nothing. The water that sustained it was so chemically stripped of nutrients that phosphorus concentrations rarely exceeded 10 parts per billion. A few drops of phosphorus dissolved in an Olympic swimming pool. That invisible threshold was the difference between a living ecosystem and a dead one. By the late 20th century, half of the original Everglades had been drained. Industrial agriculture had colonized the land south of Lake Okeechobee, and the runoff pouring into the surviving marshes carried phosphorus at 10 times the natural concentration. Native plants collapsed. The algal mats at the base of the food web disintegrated. Wading bird colonies fell by over 90%. The Everglades weren't destroyed by a single event. They were poisoned by a chemical shift so slight that most people couldn't detect it in a glass of water. The response, when politics and litigation finally forced it into existence, was the largest constructed wetland system ever built. 57,000 acres of engineered marshland arrayed along the northern boundary of the remaining Everglades, designed to intercept billions of gallons of agricultural runoff and clean it before it reaches the natural system downstream. The primary filter isn't concrete or steel, it's biological. Tens of thousands of acres of engineered marsh using living plants to strip phosphorus at industrial scale. The question is whether you can engineer a living machine to remove something measured in parts per billion, and whether it's actually working. For thousands of years, the Everglades functioned as a self-cleaning system. Water flowed south across porous limestone, and the chemistry of that rock promoted rapid, continuous removal of phosphorus through a cascade of biological and mineral reactions. The result was an ecosystem adapted to extreme nutrient starvation. Sawgrass, the dominant plant, evolved to grow slowly, hoard every molecule of phosphorus it absorbed, and outcompete anything that needed more. Periphyton, thick, spongy mats of algae and microorganisms that form in crystal clear water, blanketed the surface and clung to submerged stems, producing oxygen, anchoring habitat, and feeding an enormous web of invertebrates, small fish, and crustaceans. Those smaller organisms fed the wading birds and the alligators. The whole chain depended on water staying clean enough to sustain the periphyton at its base. Then the federal government and the state of Florida broke the chain. Driven by hurricane damage and the economic pressure to open farmland, they built the Central and Southern Florida Flood Control Project. Over 1,100 miles of canals, levees, and pump stations that drained roughly half the original wetland. The biggest piece was the creation of the Everglades Agricultural Area, more than 440,000 acres of drained peat soil immediately south of Lake Okeechobee, converted into industrial sugarcane and vegetable production. The drainage worked exactly as designed. The farming worked. What nobody managed was where the water went afterwards. Stormwater from the agricultural area, loaded with phosphorus from fertilizer, from decomposing peat, from the sheer intensity of industrial farming, poured into the surviving marshes. In an ecosystem calibrated to 10 parts per billion, that runoff arrived above 100. The effect was a cascade. The excess phosphorus acted as concentrated fertilizer, triggering a biological chain reaction. First, the periphyton, unable to tolerate even small increases above that 10 parts per billion threshold, collapsed. Without periphyton, the invertebrate populations crashed. Without invertebrates, the small fish disappeared. Without the fish, wading bird colonies, wood storks, roseate spoonbills, great egrets, fell from hundreds of thousands of nesting pairs to a fraction of their former numbers. Into the vacated space came cattails. Southern cattail absorbs phosphorus at twice the rate of native sawgrass. In enriched water, it grows explosively, forming dense walls that choke out open water, block sunlight, and convert diverse marshland into biological monoculture. The Everglades weren't slowly degrading, they were being overwritten. By the 1980s, the science was clear. The agricultural runoff was the primary driver of collapse. And yet nothing moved. The sugar industry was one of the most powerful political lobbies in Florida. The state's own regulatory agencies refused to enforce existing water quality laws. The result was a deadlock, scientific consensus on one side, entrenched economic interest on the other, and a dying ecosystem between them. The deadlock broke in October 1988, and it broke because of a federal prosecutor who was supposed to be chasing drug cartels. Dexter Lehtinen was the United States Attorney for the Southern District of Florida, a man who'd grown up hunting and camping in the Everglades and watched the system deteriorate over decades. Suing a state government required explicit permission from the Department of Justice in Washington, permission he knew he wouldn't get. So his staff spent months combing the federal prosecutor's manual for specific legal causes of action that didn't require authorization from headquarters. They found them. See, the timing was the entire strategy. Lehtinen filed the lawsuit on October 11th, less than a month before the 1988 election, at the exact moment Republican candidate George Bush was hammering his opponent over pollution in Boston Harbor. The administration couldn't kill the suit without contradicting its own campaign messaging. Lehtinen had trapped his own superiors. Washington was furious, but the lawsuit held. When Governor Lawton Chiles took office, he walked into federal court, bypassed his own defense attorneys, and publicly surrendered. "I brought my sword," he said. "I want to find out who I can give my sword to." The resulting consent decree, signed in 1992 and expanded by the Everglades Forever Act 2 years later, legally compelled the state to build thousands of acres of artificial wetlands to clean the agricultural runoff before it reached the natural Everglades. Lehtinen also engineered a failsafe. He ensured the Miccosukee tribe of Indians, whose ancestral lands sat directly in the path of the pollution, gained independent legal standing to enforce the settlement's terms regardless of which administration occupied Washington. The lawsuit was now locked in place. The legal deadlock was broken, but the task that remained, designing a biological system capable of hitting the 10 parts per billion target, sat at the outer edge of what constructed wetlands had ever been asked to do. What they built covers 57,000 acres across 5 massive regional facilities. The water flows in sequence, cell by cell, getting cleaner at each step. The architecture rests on 3 interlocking mechanisms. Remove any one, and the others fail. The first mechanism is the heavy filter. When agricultural runoff enters the system, it flows into large front-end cells dominated by dense stands of cattail, the same species that's destroying the natural Everglades downstream. Here's the thing. In the wild, the cattail is the enemy. It outcompetes native sawgrass, chokes out open water, and overruns the marsh until nothing else survives. But inside a controlled treatment cell, those same aggressive traits become the primary tool. Cattail absorbs phosphorus at twice the rate of any native plant. It grows fast, produces enormous volumes of biomass, and tolerates the high-nutrient agricultural water that would kill most other wetland species. The same biology destroying the downstream ecosystem is deliberately cultivated as the upstream cleaning mechanism. Same plant. Opposite outcome. The difference is the engineering around it, but the cattail cells hit a ceiling. They reliably pull phosphorus from over 100 parts per billion down to somewhere around 20 or 30. That's an enormous reduction, but 20 parts per billion is still double the legal limit. Still more than enough to trigger periphyton collapse and cattail invasion in the natural marshes. The heavy filter catches the bulk of the pollution. It cannot finish the job, so the partially treated water moves into the second mechanism, the polishing engine. These downstream cells are filled with submerged plants, species like southern naiad, coontail, pondweed, and a macroalga called muskgrass that grow entirely underwater. And they remove phosphorus through a process completely different from anything the cattails do. The submerged plants photosynthesize within the water column itself. During daylight, they consume dissolved carbon dioxide so rapidly that they alter the water chemistry around them, driving the pH sharply upward. The phosphorus doesn't just settle, it turns to stone. But the polishing engine creates its own vulnerability. The calcium carbonate sediment it produces is loose, chalky, and light. It sits on the wetland floor like a dusting of powder. And these cells are enormous. Some stretch thousands of acres across open, flat, shallow water. When wind blows across that expanse, it generates waves. The waves churn the bottom, and the loose sediment, loaded with carefully captured phosphorus, gets ripped back into the water column and swept toward the outflow gates. A single sustained wind event can undo weeks of treatment. But wind isn't the only threat. South Florida's weather runs on extremes: hurricanes that dump billions of gallons in hours, droughts that drain a shallow wetland to bare soil. If a massive storm surge floods the treatment cells too quickly, the high velocity water uproots the delicate submerged plants and scours the sediment downstream. The system that cleans trillions of gallons can be wrecked by a single storm if nothing absorbs the shock. That's the role of the flow equalization basins, massive deep-water reservoirs built upstream of the treatment wetlands. During a hurricane, runoff gets pumped into the reservoirs instead of flooding the treatment cells. Then, over weeks, water managers release it at a controlled rate, giving the downstream biology the stability it needs. During droughts, the same reservoirs feed water back to keep the submerged plants alive and the soils permanently covered. 57,000 acres of engineered biology that requires permanent management, constant monitoring, and continuous physical intervention to keep operating. There's no point at which you turn it on and walk away. The system didn't start cleanly. When the first major facility began operations, it failed almost immediately. Massive overloading and poorly timed chemical treatments caused the wetland to release phosphorus instead of capturing it. Early outflow numbers from several facilities sat in the 30s and 40s, sometimes higher. The prototype had proved the biology could work. Scaling it to tens of thousands of acres proved that biology at this scale is brutally hard to control. But the largest facility told a different story. STA-34, 17,000 acres in western Palm Beach County, the single largest constructed wetland on Earth, began reaching its stride by the second decade of operation. Its sheer size gave water enough time to move through the full treatment sequence without being rushed. The cattail cells accumulated deep peat layers, the submerged muskgrass beds matured, the bulrush strips anchored, and the outflow numbers stabilized between 13 and 15 parts per billion, not 10, but close enough that downstream monitoring began registering something no one had seen in this watershed for decades: periphyton, the thick algal mats whose collapse had been the first signal of ecosystem death, started reappearing near the outflow structures. The foundation of the food web was reassembling itself, not because anyone planted it, because the water was finally clean enough for it to come back. From above, you'd struggle to tell the engineered marsh from the wild Everglades downstream. Wading birds nest in the cattail stands. Alligators cruise the channels between cells. The system that was built as industrial filtration had become functioning wetland habitat, not as a design goal, but as a consequence of getting the water chemistry right. Across the full network, over 31 years of operation, the STAs have treated 9.4 trillion gallons of agricultural runoff. They've captured and permanently retained 3,721 metric tons of phosphorus. The long-term load reduction across all facilities stands at 78%. The crown jewel, STA-34, has treated 9.6 million acre-feet of water, retained over 1,000 metric tons of phosphorus on its own, and achieved an 85% load reduction. In its strongest years, it discharges at 15 parts per billion. In one exceptional year, it hit 12. Put it this way: before these wetlands existed, every drop of runoff from 440,000 acres of industrial farmland flowed straight into one of the most sensitive ecosystems on the continent. Now, the bulk of that runoff passes through a biological machine that removes roughly 4/5 of its phosphorus load before it reaches anything natural. That's what the system has delivered, but the legal target is 10. No facility can exceed 19 parts per billion in any single year, and the tighter standard requires discharge at or below 13 in at least 3 years out of every 5. STA-34 is meeting that standard. Most of the other facilities are not. In water year 2025, a severe June rainfall drove high inflows across the network, and the aggregate annual outflow climbed to 29 parts per billion. Independent monitoring confirmed that none of the 5 major facilities were on a compliant trajectory that year. The gap is real, and it's being addressed with more engineering. A new 6,500-acre treatment wetland is under construction. A 10,500-acre reservoir is being built to capture Lake Okeechobee discharges that currently devastate the coastal estuaries with toxic algae, holding that water until the STAs can clean it and send it south. Upstream, 22 miles of the Kissimmee River, the historical headwater of the entire system, destroyed in the 1960s when a straight canal was dredged through its meandering floodplain, have been physically reconstructed. 44 miles of river channel rebuilt. 20,000 acres of wetlands restored to slow and filter water before it even reaches the lake. A few drops in a swimming pool. That's the chemical difference the entire 57,000-acre system was built to address. It has captured nearly 4,000 metric tons of pollution. It has treated more water than most cities will see in a century, and it hasn't fully closed the distance between what the system delivers and what the ecosystem requires. The Everglades are being saved. They are not yet saved. The distance between those two statements is about 5 parts per billion. And every acre of engineered marsh, every strip of bulrush anchoring loose sediment to the floor, every reservoir absorbing the force of a hurricane exists to close it. The Everglades weren't broken by a single catastrophe. They were broken by a chemical load so small it's measured in parts per billion, compounding year after year until the whole system flipped. The fix isn't a single repair either. It's a living machine that has to run every day, through every storm, across every drought, pulling an invisible contaminant from the water one reaction at a time.